2 hours and 14 minutes. That's how long he stood there yelling at me in the operations briefing room in Cleveland. I watched every minute tick by on that ridiculous chrome wall clock behind his head while 32 people sat frozen. My peers, my staff, even the temp who just started that morning. Not a single person said a word when he slammed his hand on the conference table, hard enough to knock over my glass of water. No one looked away when he called me a catastrophic liability and the biggest mistake in department history. Apparently, a 6.2% dip in our quarterly output was enough to justify a public takedown. When it finally ended, my navy blouse clung to my back, damp under my gray blazer. The room was silent, like air had turned to wet cement. And then I heard my own voice, calm and precise. "Anything else, sir?" He actually blinked, like he'd expected tears or a resignation. "No," he finally muttered. "Just fix it." I nodded, gathered my notes, and walked out slow and steady. 32 silent stares followed me to the door. I didn't break until I got to my Toyota in the underground lot. Then I gripped the steering wheel and screamed until my throat was raw. That was Tuesday, April 9th, the day I knew Richard Ames had to fall. But I should probably tell you who I am. I'm Carmen Delgado, 42, Senior Operations Strategist at a major logistics firm headquartered in Ohio. Or, I was, until 3 months ago. Colleagues describe me as precise, even-tempered, the type who color-codes dashboards and builds triple redundancies into every system. My dad says I'm all logic, no fluff. But there's something you should know about people like me. We don't just follow the rules. We learn who wrote them and why. We track patterns. We anticipate pressure points. We understand consequences before others even see the problem. And that day in the briefing room? That wasn't the end. That was ignition. Before I get into what happened next, please take a moment to like this video if it resonates with you. Subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon so you never miss a story like this. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because what I'm about to reveal could change how you view justice in the workplace forever. Let me tell you about Richard Ames, 51, Chief Operations Officer, MBA from Wharton. The kind of man who owns a cabin in Vermont but never goes hiking. He just likes posting photos of it on LinkedIn with hashtags like #nature clears the mind. He'd been with Cardinal Logistics for nearly 2 decades and had the ear of the CEO in every boardroom. 7 years ago, he handpicked me for a fast-track promotion to Senior Operations Strategist, saying I had instincts that couldn't be taught. And for 5 years, I delivered. My division beat efficiency benchmarks every quarter. We reduced bottlenecks, improved delivery windows, and even got featured in an industry spotlight for innovation. Clients asked for me by name. Then, last spring, something shifted. Richard stopped acknowledging wins. He began nitpicking things that had never been an issue. Suddenly, I wasn't invited to the meetings I used to lead. I brought it up, calmly, professionally. He nodded like he cared, said he'd look into it, but nothing changed. So I started documenting everything. Emails, call notes, Slack messages, just in case. Then came the Norwalk Foods account, one of the largest contracts we'd ever seen. Richard handed it to my team, with a laughably unrealistic timeline. When I flagged the concern, he leaned back and said, "I thought you were a pro, Carmen. Prove it." So we did. 14 days. My team barely slept. We built a seamless proposal addressing every logistics pain point Norwalk had flagged. The night before the pitch, I was still at the office, triple-checking models. The next morning, Richard summoned me. "There's been a shift," he said, still typing. "Norwalk wants something fresh. Bryce's team will take the meeting." Bryce Connors, the golden boy with 9 months at the company and a tea time with Richard every Saturday. "My team's done the heavy lifting," I said evenly. "They deserve to be in the room." "They'll use your data," Richard replied. But Norwalk asked for a new face. Nothing personal. I'd spoken to Norwalk's COO 3 days earlier. She was expecting me. I said I wanted to attend. Richard finally glanced up, his voice almost patronizing. "That won't be necessary. Focus on your metrics. Your last quarter wasn't impressive." I walked out of his office with a sick feeling in my gut. Not because it was unexpected, but because I'd seen the playbook before. With Darlene in HR and with Hugo from procurement. Richard built people up, then cut them off when they became too visible. Richard had a pattern. Build people up, give them just enough visibility to rise, then gut their credibility the moment they looked like competition. I'd seen him do it before, but when Bryce's presentation won over Norwalk, I knew I was next in line. That afternoon, Richard blasted out a company-wide email celebrating Bryce's bold vision and exceptional leadership. My team wasn't mentioned once. The very next week came the Tuesday meeting. 2 hours and 14 minutes of public demolition. What Richard didn't know was I was already prepared. Not for that exact ambush, but for the eventual fall. People like me, we read trends. We catalog behavior. That night, I didn't cry. I brewed strong coffee, opened my laptop, and pulled up 3 folders I'd quietly built over the past 6 months. The first held examples of Richard taking credit for work done by women and people of color. Emails, meeting transcripts, decks with metadata that proved who really authored them. The second, records showing how he manipulated internal data, boosting his division's results while making others, like mine, look worse. The third, and the one that scared me the most, evidence of Richard funneling high-value contracts to a consulting firm owned by his brother-in-law, direct violations of company policy and likely federal law. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think twice about what power really looks like, go ahead and subscribe. There's more to come, and trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. But I knew that wasn't enough. Richard was entrenched. He had relationships. They might slap him on the wrist, but they wouldn't take him down. And they'd certainly come for me once he caught wind of it. I needed more than evidence. I needed leverage, undeniable, immovable leverage. So I created a plan. 3 phases. It would take months. It would require stealth, discipline, and more nerve than I'd ever used in my entire career. Phase 1. Allies. Not just anyone. People who had credibility, who'd seen what I had, who had scars of their own. I started with Brianna Chan, a senior analyst who'd been overlooked for promotion twice, despite glowing performance reviews. Richard once asked her if her traditional Chinese surname made her harder to market to clients. I invited her to grab coffee 10 blocks from HQ. "I'm not here to vent," I told her after a few minutes. "I'm here because I'm doing something about Richard Ames, and I think you might want to be a part of it." She studied me. "What exactly are you planning?" "Justice," I said quietly. Brianna took a long sip. Norwalk wasn't the first time he pulled this, was it? "Number and you weren't the only one he belittled." She nodded slowly. "I'm listening." Next came Daniel Ruiz, a senior financial analyst. Months earlier, he'd compiled a report showing suspicious expense allocations across regional accounts, one that Richard Ames quietly buried before it ever reached compliance. Then there was Julia Mendez from legal. She'd raised red flags about Richard's client affiliations, only to be reassigned to a non-client-facing role with no explanation. One by one, I built a discreet coalition. We never met as a group, never texted, never emailed. We used encrypted messaging apps and met in low-traffic spots, quiet diners, public libraries, anywhere without surveillance. Phase 2 was evidence. Hard, irrefutable proof that couldn't be brushed aside as a misunderstanding. Julia broke down the exact corporate policy violations Richard had committed. Daniel walked me through the accounting maze, teaching me how Richard disguised vendor relationships under shell LLCs. Brianna showed me how to build heat maps from internal data, visuals that clearly demonstrated Richard's manipulations across quarterly reporting. I was still doing my job flawlessly, clocking in at 6 a.m., leaving around 8 p.m., never giving Richard the slightest excuse to target me officially. But every spare moment went toward the investigation. Then came the breakthrough I hadn't expected. I received a meeting invite from Richard's executive assistant, Naomi Wells. No subject line, just a location, parking garage, B-level stairwell. She was already there when I arrived, glancing around nervously. "I don't have much time," she said. "But you need to know, Mr. Ames has been meeting with the CEO about restructuring your division. They're talking about eliminating your role altogether. My stomach tightened. Why are you telling me this? Naomi's eyes went cold. 2 years ago, before I worked for him directly, I filed a harassment report against Richard. It vanished. When I asked about it, HR warned me that pushing the issue could affect my future with the company. I'm sorry, I said, and I meant it. I don't want your pity, she replied. I want accountability. She pulled a small USB drive from her coat. I've been tracking his meetings, saving emails, and collecting internal files. Some of it may help you. I took it. This is incredibly brave. Naomi shook her head. It's survival. I heard what he said about replacing me. Someone younger, more camera-friendly. That's the phrase he used. That night, I reviewed the contents. They were explosive. Evidence of Richard fabricating quarterly data, rerouting clients, and receiving silent kickbacks through a family-owned shell firm. Now, we had enough to bring him down. And most disturbing of all was the pattern. Richard Ames had spent years targeting employees he saw as threats. Women, people of color, younger high performers. He undermined them, isolated them, erased their contributions. I felt vindicated and sick to my stomach. We now had enough evidence to not just oust Richard, but to potentially trigger a federal investigation into financial misconduct and ethical breaches. But going public would be catastrophic. Cardinal Logistics stock would crater. Hundreds of people, innocent people, would lose their jobs, their savings, their retirement plans. This couldn't be a nuclear strike. It had to be surgical. That's when I finalized Phase 3, the riskiest stage of the plan. I would have to convince the board of directors that removing Richard quietly and immediately was in their best interest. Not just ethically, but financially. I needed to present the evidence so clearly and compellingly that they'd have no choice but to act. And I needed to do it in a way that ensured Richard couldn't retaliate against me. The company's annual executive retreat was scheduled the following month at a luxury mountain resort in Colorado. Every C-suite leader would be there, CEO included, but not me. I wasn't high-ranking enough to get an invitation. Fortunately, Julia Mendez from legal was attending. She was scheduled to give a short compliance presentation. We spent the next 3 weeks building the most airtight 7-minute slideshow of our lives. Email trails, accounting logs, whistleblower testimony, screen captures, file metadata, all compiled into an encrypted website accessible only by password, ready for projection. The plan was simple. Julia would begin with standard regulatory slides, then pivot into a targeted deep dive. The name Richard Ames would only appear once the proof was already in front of the board. The night before the retreat, I couldn't sleep. If this failed, we could all be fired, blacklisted, sued. Richard had friends in high places. At exactly 4:37 a.m., my phone rang. "Carmen, it's Julia," she whispered. "They changed the schedule. My talks moved to tomorrow, and they've cut my time to 3 minutes." My heart dropped. "There's more," she said. "Richard cornered me at the reception, said he's excited to chat about my future. Carmen, he knows." I stood up, pacing. "Where's the CEO right now?" "Still at the reception. Dinner's about to start." "Is the presentation loaded on your laptop?" "Yes, but..." "Fine. Daniel's there, right?" "Yeah?" "Tell him to cause a distraction at dinner. I'll guide you through the rest." "Tell him to create a distraction during dinner," I said. "Big enough to clear the room, but not serious enough to shut the whole event down. Then get the CEO alone." Julia hesitated. "Carmen, I don't know if I can..." "You can," I said firmly. "We've come too far to freeze now." "Okay, I'll call you after." The next 3 hours crawled. I paced the floor of my Cleveland apartment, checking my phone every 5 minutes, feeling every second like a ticking time bomb. At 8:23 p.m., Julia finally called back. "It worked," she whispered, breathless. "Daniel knocked over a full tray of drinks, straight onto the state comptroller's wife." I nearly choked. "You're kidding." Everyone rushed to help. I pulled the CEO aside, told him I had serious information that couldn't wait. He agreed to see the first 2 minutes of the deck on my laptop. He didn't say a word, just told me to follow him. And he took me to his suite, called in 3 board members. They watched the entire thing. My pulse thumped in my ears. What did they say? They asked me to stay another day in Colorado, said this needed to be handled immediately. Then, he thanked me for coming forward. I collapsed into my chair, my heart still racing. And Richard? No idea. He wasn't there, but the CEO's assistant started making phone calls before I left. The next morning, I woke to 3 missed calls from Julia and a single message. Check your email now. I bolted upright, grabbed my laptop. A message had just landed from the CEO's executive office requesting I join a secure video call at exactly 9 a.m. It was 8:43. No time for anything but a clean blouse and a hairbrush. I logged in from my dining table, fingers trembling, when the screen lit up. Gerald Manning, Cardinal's CEO, sat at the head of a sleek boardroom. 4 board members flanked him, along with the company's general counsel. Ms. Delgado, he began, his expression unreadable. Thank you for joining us. I nodded, trying to appear calm, though my insides felt like jelly. We've reviewed serious allegations regarding Mr. Ames's conduct and financial dealings. This information appears to have been collected by you and a select group of employees over a significant period. Is that correct? Deep breath. Yes, sir. After witnessing repeated misconduct and unethical behavior, I felt a responsibility to document what I saw. One of the board members leaned forward. Ms. Delgado, why didn't you bring these concerns through formal channels? HR? The ethics hotline? I met his gaze squarely. With respect, sir, I did. Twice. Both reports were closed without investigation. I paused, then continued. Additionally, Mr. Ames's former executive assistant filed a harassment complaint 2 years ago. It vanished from HR records. When she followed up, she was warned about jeopardizing her future here. The room went dead silent. Gerald exchanged a look with the general counsel. Ms. Delgado, he said finally, we're launching an immediate investigation into all of these claims. Mr. Ames has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. We'd like you to come to headquarters today and provide a complete statement. Of course, I replied, though I was still waiting for the catch. And, Ms. Delgado, Gerald added, softening slightly, while we don't endorse how the information was compiled or delivered, we acknowledge the courage it took to come forward. Please know, there will be no retaliation against you or your colleagues. I nearly laughed out loud. No retaliation? After years of silence while Richard trampled reputations, but I kept my expression neutral. Thank you, sir. I'll make myself available. After the call ended, I sat at my dining table, staring at nothing. It should have felt like a win. Richard on leave, an investigation underway, but something was off. Too smooth. Too corporate. They weren't pursuing justice. They were managing fallout. I'd seen this play out before. A confidential separation agreement. NDAS. Richard walks away wealthy and untarnished, free to repeat the cycle somewhere else. My phone buzzed. It was Brianna. They just called me in, she said, skipping pleasantries. Statement time. Same here. Richard's officially out, temporarily. She was quiet for a beat. You don't sound relieved. Because we both know what comes next, I said flatly. Settlements, silence, a retirement package, a LinkedIn rebrand. So what do? I closed my eyes. Phase 3? B. Carmen, no. We agreed. Last resort. It's dangerous. Meet me at my place in an hour, I said. Bring Daniel if you can. I'll call Julia. Phase 3. B was the emergency lever we never wanted to pull. The failsafe for when the company chose optics over accountability. It was risky. It was messy. But it would make sure Richard Ames finally faced real consequences, and that he'd never hurt anyone at Cardinal again. ChatGPT Jun Noi. Nung no kung ko the tro laiva an huong jen tatka chung ta. By noon that Saturday, my Cleveland apartment had become mission control. Brianna, Daniel, Julia, and 2 other members of our coalition were scattered across my living room. Laptops open, coffee cups half full, nerves stretched thin. The company's internal review could take weeks, I told them. And during that time, they'll be crafting statements, spinning narratives, and, most likely, negotiating Richard's exit quietly. They can't just bury this, Daniel said. The financial evidence is too strong. They won't bury it, Julia replied. They'll reframe it. Misunderstandings, poor judgment, internal miscommunication. I've seen it happen before. I nodded. Exactly. That's why we need a failsafe, something that ensures the truth comes out, even if they try to silence us. You're talking about leaking confidential data, Daniel said quietly. That could be career-ending, maybe even worse. Not if we do it right, I said. We build a digital dead man switch. I explained the mechanism. If Richard wasn't fired for cause, if there was no public acknowledgement of his misconduct, or if any of us were pressured into NDAs, then the evidence would automatically be released, securely and anonymously, to 3 veteran business journalists, key financial regulators, and an employment watchdog group. The room went still. We'd be risking everything, Brianna said at last. We already are, I said. At least this guarantees results. One by one, they nodded. We spent the next 4 hours setting up the system, masking every digital breadcrumb. We agreed on the conditions that would trigger release: golden parachutes, corporate silence, or attempts to intimidate any one of us. Then, we went to headquarters, separately. Each of us gave our statements to legal counsel, HR, and external investigators. I turned over all the evidence, except the failsafe. That stayed in our control. For 2 long weeks, we kept working like nothing had happened. Richard stayed on leave, his office dark, his reserved parking spot empty, and then, finally, it came. A company-wide email from Gerald Manning. Following a thorough investigation, Cardinal Logistics has concluded that Richard Ames engaged in conduct inconsistent with our company's values and ethical standards. Mr. Ames is no longer employed by Cardinal, effective immediately. The rest of the email was filled with polished HR language, commitments to values, reassurances of change. But the subtext was clear. He was gone. Richard was gone. But there was no mention of financial misconduct, no acknowledgement of the careers he derailed, and certainly no apology to those he'd harassed or quietly pushed out. That afternoon, I was summoned to Gerald Manning's office. He sat alone behind his towering walnut desk, shoulders slouched, tie loosened. "Ms. Delgado," he said, motioning to the seat across from him. "Please, sit." "I'll stand," I replied. "Thank you." He gave a small nod, studying me like I was both a problem and a solution. "I wanted to inform you personally. Mr. Ames has been terminated. No severance package." "The investigation confirmed everything?" I asked, keeping my tone level. "It confirmed enough to justify removal," he said carefully. "But not all of it," I pressed. Gerald's jaw tightened. "We found sufficient cause. That's what matters." "With respect, sir, it's not. What about the careers he damaged? The data he manipulated? The kickbacks? The harassment?" "We're addressing those matters internally," he replied, tone clipped. "As for reputational harm, I've reviewed personnel files, including yours. Compensation adjustments will be made accordingly." "And public acknowledgement?" He leaned forward. "You've accomplished what you set out to do. Richard Ames is no longer with the company, but dragging Cardinal Logistics through the mud helps no one. It hurts our employees, our clients, our investors. Is that what you want?" I met his eyes and didn't blink. What I want is accountability, not just for Richard, but for the culture that protected him, for the system that let him operate unchecked for years. He narrowed his gaze. "The same system that just fired one of its most senior executives based on your evidence? The same system that hasn't retaliated against you or your team?" I didn't look away. "The same system that ignored HR complaints, that made internal reports vanish, that stood by while Richard targeted people, especially women and minorities, for over a decade." Silence stretched. Then Gerald asked, "What exactly are you demanding, Ms. Delgado?" "A public statement, one that details the full scope of the misconduct, a formal apology, and an independent third-party audit of all promotions, raises, and performance reviews handled under Richard's authority in the past 5 years." He scoffed. "That's unreasonable. The legal risk alone. Not as risky as letting the rest of the evidence hit the press," I said, calm, certain. You know I'm not the only one holding copies. 3 days later, the company issued a public statement that stunned even me. They acknowledged discrimination, harassment, and financial manipulation, and announced the independent audit I demanded. The statement even included a formal apology to those whose careers and well-being had been damaged. It didn't name Richard Ames, but everyone in the industry knew exactly who it meant. His reputation disintegrated overnight. No golden parachute, no graceful exit to another executive role, no quiet rewriting of history. 2 days after the announcement, a journalist from a major business outlet called asking for comment. I politely declined, but the article ran anyway, filled with anonymous quotes detailing Richard's abusive behavior, data manipulation, and favoritism. Then came another story. And another. Within a week, Richard Ames had become the poster boy for executive misconduct and systemic failure. His name became toxic. No firm would touch him. 1 month later, I received word that I was being promoted to executive director, with a sizable raise. Gerald Manning delivered the news himself, smile tight, posture composed. We both knew this wasn't purely merit-based. It was strategic, a shield against future lawsuits, a gesture of goodwill to the woman who could have burned the company to the ground. I accepted it anyway. Brianna finally received the promotion she should have earned 2 years ago. Daniel was named head of a newly formed financial oversight committee. Julia was tapped to lead a revamped ethics and compliance division. Even Naomi, Richard's former assistant, was offered a higher-paying position with clear advancement opportunities. On paper, justice had been served. But something inside me didn't feel victorious, because the system hadn't changed on its own. We'd forced it to shift, and the second we stopped pushing, it would slide back into protecting power over people. That's when I made my final decision. I accepted the promotion, took the raise, settled into the corner office. I smiled through board meetings, gave polite feedback in strategy sessions. I played the role they needed. For 6 months. Then I resigned. My letter was simple. I was leaving to launch a consulting firm focused on workplace culture reform and executive accountability. What I didn't mention was that Brianna, Daniel, Julia, and a few others were joining me as founding partners, or that our first 3 clients would be led by former Cardinal employees, people Richard had once forced out who now held C-suite titles elsewhere. On my last day, as I packed up my office, Gerald stopped in. He leaned against the doorframe and said, "You know, Carmen, I've seen a lot in 34 years, but I've never met anyone quite like you." I smiled without looking up. "I'll take that as a compliment." "It is," he replied quietly. "It really is. You could have just taken Richard down," Gerald said, his voice surprisingly soft. "But instead, you changed the entire company. You forced us to confront things we've ignored for years." For the first time, I looked up at him. "And yet," I replied, "when I walk out that door today, you'll still be running the company the same way." Gerald gave a faint smile. "Maybe. Or maybe you've left a deeper mark than you think." He straightened. "The board just approved a complete overhaul of our misconduct reporting system. Anonymous, third-party managed. Even I won't have visibility until each report is investigated independently." I raised an eyebrow. "That's unexpected." "You've made enemies, Carmen. Serious ones. But you've also made some admirers." He picked up his phone, then paused. "What's your consulting firm called again?" "Delgado Strategies," I said. He nodded. "Expect a call from our HR department in the next month. We'll be looking for outside guidance to implement the new systems." And with that, he turned and left. I stood there alone, cardboard box in my arms, feeling something I hadn't expected. Not just relief, but hope. Not just the satisfaction of toppling someone who deserved it, but the possibility that maybe, just maybe, real change was possible. 2 years have passed since then. Delgado Strategies now has 27 employees and a growing client base across 3 continents. We help companies identify toxic leadership patterns before they become crises. We train executives to build cultures that actually include people, not just market the idea of inclusion. We design accountability systems that don't rely on personal bravery to function. And Richard? Last I heard, he was trying to launch a leadership coaching business from his suburban home. It's not going well. When you Google his name, the first 3 pages are filled with articles about his misconduct and abrupt termination. Digital karma doesn't forget. As for me, I sleep better now. The nightmares about those 2 hours and 14 minutes of public humiliation have mostly stopped. I still flinch occasionally when someone raises their voice in a meeting, but I'm working on that. Cardinal Logistics? They became one of our clients 6 months ago. Gerald retired last year, and the new CEO seems genuinely committed to cultural reform. Sometimes change has to be forced, but if you're lucky and relentless, it can grow beyond you. What I did wasn't revenge. It was justice. And if you're in a similar situation, document everything. Then act. Find allies, people who see what you see, even if they've been too afraid to say it out loud. You're not imagining things. You're not being too sensitive. You're not crazy for feeling mistreated. You're reacting to a system that rewards silence and punishes accountability. And here's the truth. Systems can change, but very rarely from the inside. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away, not in defeat, but in strategy, in purpose. Because walking away isn't always quitting. Sometimes it's repositioning yourself to create real change. If my story resonated with you, if any part of what I shared felt familiar, please hit that like button. It helps the message reach the people who need it most. If you know someone working in a toxic environment, someone being discredited, isolated, or gaslighted by a powerful figure, share this video with them. Let them know they're not alone. And if you want to hear more stories about workplace justice, about leadership accountability, about real transformation that doesn't come from slogans, but from courageous people pushing back, subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below and share your experience. You never know who needs to hear your story. And sometimes, seeing someone else speak up is the first step toward taking action. Because that's how change really happens. One story at a time, one witness at a time, one act of courage at a time. I stood in that operations briefing room for 2 hours and 14 minutes while my integrity was shredded in front of 32 people. But I didn't break, I didn't disappear, I didn't let him win. And I'm not standing alone anymore. Neither are you. If you've made it this far, I want to ask you for something. Not for me, but for everyone who's ever been silenced, overlooked, or pushed out for speaking the truth. Drop a comment below. Tell me what part of this story hit home. Share your own experience, or just leave a message of support. I read them all, and trust me, it matters. Your words might be the sign someone else needs to keep going. And if you've ever been in my shoes, here's my advice. Document everything. Trust your instincts, and never let fear convince you that staying silent is the safer choice.